video about analyzing histograms. This is for our honor students, but anyone's welcome to watch it. Okay, let's start out by first looking at some shapes of histograms. Generally, just looking at the general shape, we can see these different forms. The first form we're going to look at is called uniform, and this is where there is no clear bump along the data. The next one is unimodal. That means that it has one clear bump. Then we have bimodal, which is two clear bumps. Notice that these two aren't exactly the same height, but they seem to be pretty significant in the data. And the fourth shape, general shape of a histogram, we would call multimodal. And this is where we have three or more clear bumps. And we need to be careful with multimodal because sometimes we'll have so many bumps, the data is so big, that it starts resembling uniform. We need to look at this with fuzzy vision where we kind of let the data meld together a little bit. The next part we're going to look at is a special case of unimodal histograms. The first one is the what we call normal. And in this case, we have quite a bell shape. It's not always perfect with real data, but if we draw just a general shape of the function and it turns out to be a bell shape like that, we call it normal. Next example would be right skewed. And this is where there's more data to the right of the bump. So in this case, we'll see that there's more data over here on the right side of the bump. It's also convenient to notice that there's a tail coming away from the data on the right side. Both of those seems to work pretty well to identify these. And the last one is left skewed. And on left skewed, again, we have this time, here's the unimodal bump, and most of the data is on the left side. This one isn't quite as clear as the right skewed as an example, but it's pretty good. Then as we look at unimodal, there's also shapes that can be symmetrical. And once again, we're just kind of looking through the vocabulary of this, so we're not really going into a lot of detail. But you'll notice that most of the detail on this normal curve, right, most of the data, half and half on either side. On this uniform curve, the data is fairly well split. On this bimodal example, the data is split half and half. And then finally, this could be kind of like a multimodal, do you see? But if we're not looking quite as tight and as close to that, it really does look very similar to a curve. In fact, because there is such a significant bump in the top one here, I would call this one a normal curve, and it is symmetrical about the center. Here's an example from real life. Okay, we've been facing this coronavirus stuff forever, and this is data that was gathered from early on in the coronavirus part of deaths per day. And this went from March through June. And as you can see, this thing really does form a curve. Very similar to the bell curve. It is slightly skewed off to one side, but as we're looking at it in general terms, this does look fairly uniform. Not uniform, excuse me. This does look fairly normal. And there's one clear big bump. So we would mark unimodal for one clear bump, and we would mark normal. We could also mark symmetrical. So the key to this is to mark everything that applies to the situation. Let's look at another example. Okay, in this case, this is the cases in Utah of coronavirus with the 7-day average highlighted there in blue. So as you notice with this situation, we come along here, and general terms, generally speaking, looking back on the data, this has a really clear, distinct, big rise and fall here in the middle. I know that it looks a little bit like a multi-bump right here. If we were maybe zooming in closer on the data, this would look very similar to like a bimodal or multimodal. But because we're looking back from a distance and looking farther away from the data, it really does look like this here. And so as you can see, there's a clear tail on the left side, meaning that there is more data on the left side of the curve. And so as we look at this curve here, we'll then use this as, let me turn my pen so it doesn't just keep erasing here. This thing right here looks like it has one mode, and it is not normal, it is left skewed. And it doesn't fit to do symmetrical either. So we want to just place all of those. So as you work through your section of the homework, that is what you're expected to do.